let me just officially welcome you all to this event with Process and Faith on Deconstructing Hell. Now, isn't that a compelling title? And our speaker tonight is Chad Bahl. Chad is a candidate for the doctorate in theology and ministry with Northwind Theological Seminary, where he's studying with Tom Oord. Many of you probably know of Tom's work. If not, you might want to look into it. And in working with Tom in the Open and Relational Theology program. So Chad has authored a previous book called God Unbound, an Evangelical Reconsiders Tradition in Search of Truth. And his most recent text that he's both an author and the editor of, along with other contributors, is called Deconstructing Hell, Open and Relational Responses to the Doctrine of Eternal Conscious Torment. So I think, and you'll be very interested, I'm sure he'll tell us all a little bit about his background, and I think you'll be really interested in that. So I just would like to turn it over to Chad. Oh, let me mention, Jared is with us. Jared works for Process and Faith, and I'm still getting over a cold, so I may be losing my voice. So I think Jared will be fielding our questions at the end of Chad's presentation. So if you want to feel free to make comments in the chat, and Chad, if you want to take it away, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I definitely appreciate it. I appreciated the invite, and I was very happy to say yes to the opportunity. So I, as Sherry said, I'm currently a student of Dr. Oord's at Northwind Theological Seminary, pursuing my doctorate in theology and ministry in Open and Relational Studies. A fun fact about me, I guess, is that, you know, as a job or career, I'm a pharmacist full time. So I see pharmacy as my a career, but I don't necessarily see it as my vocation. I am very passionate about theology, have been so for decades, and am really truly enjoying the opportunity to study under Dr. Oord at Northwind to pursue that. So again, just glad to be here. So as Sherry mentioned, in 2001, I had the opportunity to publish my first book, God Unbound, an Evangelical Reconsiders Tradition in Search of Truth. The topics that I tried to tackle in that book included a lot of things, and things that I was just kind of thinking through my faith journey, but looking at the classical theistic attributes ascribed often to God, such as immutability, impassibility, and timelessness. I looked at predestination versus free will. I looked at the problem of pain, biblicism, salvific exclusivity, and evolution versus creationism. Of course, one of the topics that I looked at turned into a full-size volume, which is the Doctrine of Eternal Conscious Torment. And really, for me, I think that the two most impactful topics, I guess, for a seeker in faith, is someone curious about it, are looking at eschatology, or what happens in the afterlife, and looking at, I think, theodicy, which is basically why do bad things happen, or the problem of evil. These typically tend to be the barriers or stumbling blocks that people either sooner or later come across, that I think we need solid answers to. So that was kind of the genesis to Deconstructing Hell. Now, let me say, I did mention that God Unbound was subtitled Evangelical Considers Tradition in Search of Truth. And yeah, I will say, for me, theology is a journey. So I probably ascribed that title to myself a couple of years ago when I wrote the book. I would say I probably best fit into a post-evangelical circle right now, but I'm still evangelical as long as I get to define it. So, I would say, as long as you're saying that I'm Christocentric, that I have a high view of Scripture, that I'm a Trinitarian, that I am an activist in my faith, I think those things fit evangelicalism well, and they still fit me well. But to be honest with you, it's a journey. It's a process. I was privileged to be referenced in my book in Tom Oord's Pluriform Love. And, he described it as a good introduction to open theism, which I definitely can see that, and I definitely agree with that. I would say right now I probably find myself more in the process camp than anything else. So I tend to be fairly ecumenical in my thinking, because my theology is in process as well. So that's really kind of how I decided to approach this book. I wasn't necessarily coming up with a pat answer or solution to an alternative to the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, but I wanted to deconstruct the doctrine. Again, as ecumenical as I might be in my thinking and my theology, if something is harmful and you see it as harmful, I think we should be able to and willing to address it. And so that's what I did here. So in that, and let me just kind of move through the slides here. We created this volume, me and 15 other authors decided to come together and compile a volume. And we really set it as a response to this doctrine of eternal conscious torment. So we didn't come out saying that, there's no hell, we don't believe in hell, we're not, promoting maybe a relativistic view of things. But what we decided that we agreed on is that hell as a place of eternal conscious torment is more of a tradition than it is a reality. And we also saw that there was a vacuum in published literature. So most of the books that were out there that talked about hell were more interested in promoting a specific alternative than they were about devoting themselves to really deconstructing the doctrine itself. And so we really wanted something that was relational, not agenda driven. We wanted to propose various alternatives, and we included a bunch of different authors with different perspectives. So that was the goal behind the book. We also wanted it to be a resource. So I do think Deconstructing Hell is set up as something that you can read straight through, but we also wanted it to be a scannable reference in case you wanted to look into the history of the doctrine, the philosophy of the doctrine, the consequences of the doctrine. But we also wanted it to be accessible. So it's scholarly in the sense of it reviews a lot of material, but we believe it's accessible in the sense that anybody without any background can pick it up and read through it. So that was the goal of the book. So my goal for tonight is to briefly take you through some of that content. So one of the things I want to start off by doing, and I want to do this rather quickly because I want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. But one of the things I want to take you through is just the impact that the eternal conscious torment view of hell has had and has on our society. And we're talking psychologically, culturally, relationally. I want to say why we should deconstruct hell. And I'm going to propose that it's historically suspect, philosophically fragile, as well as biblically unsound. And then ultimately, I want to give you some live options for reconstruction. So we'll talk about some of the alternatives, which are conditional immortality, universal restoration, Tom Oord's own proposal called relentless love, and then maybe a more process relational proposal as well. So as we can see, I think we're all fairly aware, hell has had quite a, if you will, hell of an impact on our society. So I think everybody approaches it differently. Certainly there's been a psychological impact. Mark Karras, he's a therapist, and he's also an author. He's written books such as Divine Echoes, Religious Refugees, and most recently he's written a book called Diabolical Trinity, Healing Religious Trauma from a Wrathful God, a Tormenting Hell, and a Sinful Self. In fact, I think next week you guys are hosting Mark to go over his book. So he wrote a chapter in our book, which turns out to be really kind of his inspiration for writing the longer volume that he most recently penned. But he called it Into the Abyss, Mapping the Psychological Trauma of Hell Indoctrination. And in it, he talks about, one, how we all respond to hell differently. And some of us respond to hell with honestly, with a fondness. We don't have a problem with it. Maybe we think that some people deserve to suffer, for their sins. Maybe we think that it's sort of a payback for what you do in this life. And, again, that's something that's earned. So we don't have an issue with it. Some people like it because they need to feel that there's a sense of justice. Obviously, we see a lot of injustice in our world. I think in our, comfortable, often middle-class setting, here in America, we have a hard time seeing that, but with all the suffering, tragedy and hurt and pain that people go through, a sense of justice is something that makes people hopeful. And then sometimes we're fond of it because we see it as a sense of control and controlling opinions, because there's something fearful to really hang over someone's head. So again, some people approach it with fondness, but I would say that, more people probably approach it with a sense of fear. So that fear is of not being saved, to use maybe an evangelical term, not being a true believer. Am I, is it possible for me to lose my salvation? Do I live in a revolving door? If suffering in hell is something that I could potentially do for eternity, where's my security that I'm not going to do it? Liz Petter-Zenz and Esther Joy Goetz were two authors in this book that really kind of dove into that and did a fantastic job of telling their stories. I was actually on a theological forum today where the post was, hey, I'm struggling with hell. I'm scared that, I might go there, and how can I be sure that I'm, not going to go to hell? Again, teaching eternal conscious torment just evokes those feelings in people in often in really unhealthy way. So that gets to fragility. So it could be crippling, it could be debilitating. So certainly, belief in hell as eternal conscious torment can create, something we call soul wounds. And I like the term soul wound. The word for soul is derived from the Latin word for psyche. The word for wound is derived from the Greek word for soul. So soul wound seems to be fitting. But those soul wounds are formed because of debilitating anxiety, because of toxic shame, that people feel, negative self-criticism. They feel like they deserve hell. They're told that they deserve hell, right? We're told, if we grew up in a more traditional or an evangelical setting, a more conservative setting, that we are naturally sinful people. We're bad people. We're unworthy, right? Our good works are as filthy rags, to God. That could be traumatic for people to hear. And ultimately, this can translate into a diagnosable, complex form of PTSD. It can really impact our experience of God. Whether or not we want to experience God can come into question. If this is a God that, would want to or allow for the torture and torment of his creation for eternity. It can lead to unwanted feelings of separation. We want to experience God, but we don't think we deserve to or can. And in an extreme, complex PTSD can lead to self-harm, addictions. It can be a factor in harming others. And so it's serious stuff. And so psychologically, ECT has had a huge impact. In fact, there's a center called the Global Center for Religious Trauma. And in it, it says that 1 out of 3 people statistically will experience religious trauma in their lifetimes. It says that 1 out of 5 US adults are suffering from some form of religious trauma today. And as we can, clearly see, a lot of that can be easily connected to our teachings of hell. So it's significant. It has a psychological impact. From a cultural standpoint, it's pervasively messaged in our culture. Eternal conscious torment is seen everywhere you look. And Sean Ryan is one of our authors. He did a fantastic job in his chapter talking about this. He talks about how it's pervasively messaged. So who here doesn't enjoy themselves a little AC/DC Highway to Hell, or maybe the good occasional horror movie? But it's not just messaged from pop culture. It's still being messaged pervasively at times, and occasionally, sometimes, from our pulpits. Who of us hasn't heard of Jonathan Edwards and Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? And just if as an excerpt, one of the things that he says is that God holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some lonesome insect over the fire. He abhors you. He's dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into fire. You are 10,000 times 10 so abominable in his eyes, as the most hateful and venomous serpent is in ours. There is laid upon the very nature of carnal men a foundation for the torments of hell. That's pretty powerful stuff from our friend Jonathan Edwards. And not that we're necessarily hearing that as specifically and directly in our pulpits today, but we certainly are hearing it consistently and to an extent, especially in the more conservative and evangelical churches. And it's becoming, and it still is, a doctrine that if you oppose it and you oppose it vocally, you're often removed or dismissed from leadership in the church. And that's something I can attest to. I have not been in church leadership for a long time. And like I say, I'm a pharmacist, and any leadership that I've been in has only been as a layperson, but I've been a teacher at my church that I currently go to. But I was removed from having the option to teach at my church once I published this book. So, you know, it definitely has an ingrained impact in our churches. And people that disagree are often pushed away, which makes that perpetuate even more. So we see that 62% of Americans believe in hell. We see 3% of atheists. That's something that Sean pointed out that I was surprised by, believe in hell, is from Pew Research. 9% of agnostics do. 22% of the nothing in particular group do. And of course, 91% of evangelicals believe in the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, or hell as eternal conscious torment. And in America, where 35% of Americans are evangelical, we can see how pervasive it is. And it's generationally oppressive. So from the 4th century apocalypse of Paul to the 14th century Dante's Inferno, we see the oppression that the teaching of eternal conscious torment can cause. We see images in both of those of women hanging by their breasts who have been accused of propagating sexual deviance, where the men are completely absent from such punishments. We see disabled bodies being portrayed as broken, weak, effeminate, and all of these being seen as negative consequences for sin. And we see, obviously, with eternal conscious torment, we see violence as an answer to crime being portrayed. So it's had a huge impact how hell has been portrayed in our society. Like we mentioned, the patriarchy, ableism. We need to look really no further than the pandemic, right? And the mindset a lot of people had during the pandemic, that how minimally able were people willing to create exceptions and to accommodate disabled individuals, right? There was almost an attitude of it of, well, you're sick, you know, or you're older, you know, and us healthy folk were almost resentful of the accommodations we needed to make. Why? Because I think in our culture, we have a negative view of folks that, you know, need help. I think a lot of that comes from things like Paul's Apocalypse, Dante's Inferno. And again, that cultural impact can be seen. Finally, a relational impact from eternal conscious torment. So we see the relational impact towards creation. I call it evangelical escapism, but really, you know, we're often taught as evangelicals that the earth is not our home, that heaven is our home, and someday we will all be there, right? There's little care for creation, for the here and now. We see nature as fallen. We see really the perpetuation of control and the domination of nature and creation, the desire to subdue creation, to disregard creation, perpetuated over being a partnership with creation. And I think that's in part because of ECT. So it definitely impacts our relationship towards others. You know, if some are going to spend eternity in heaven and some are going to suffer consciously in hell, it perpetuates an us versus them mentality, and in versus out. You're saved, you're not saved. You know, there's a dread of judgment versus a love and a mutual maturation of folks that we should have towards those that maybe believe differently than we do. And certainly a relational impact to God, as we already mentioned. It causes intimidation, fear, resentment, and it causes atheism and agnosticism. One of the quotes that I use in the book in my chapter is from this theologian named William West, and the Resurrection and Immortality is the name of his book. But he says that God has been made so cruel and this doctrine so unthinkable that it's probably created more atheists and caused more weak believers to fall away than any other false teaching. The dread of hell has caused misery and mental anguish to countless millions. And instead of the horror of hell turning many people to God, millions of people have been turned away. And that resonates with me a lot. And I think that's the impact that ECT has had. So that's neither here nor there. That doesn't say whether or not eternal conscious torment is true. It just says it's had some really major negative consequences. So why should we then deconstruct hell? So I will propose a few things to you. The first is that I will propose that it is historically suspect. So if we look, the doctrine of hell really is virtually absent from the Old Testament. We talk about Sheol, which is the abode from the dead. This is paralleled in the Greek to the concept of Hades. So in the Old Testament, we see in Ezekiel, Samuel being summoned by the witch of Endor from the banal netherworld. We see, or in Samuel from the banal netherworld, we see Ezekiel, him in a description of the abode of the dead, really segregating the good from the wicked. But again, there's really no explicit reference to the eternal state in the whole of the Old Testament. You really don't begin to see the idea develop until first century Judaism. So really in the intertestamental period, there's very few references. Fourth Maccabees can be seen as referencing it somewhat. First Enoch and Psalm of Solomon references conditional immortality, not eternal conscious torment. But in the first century, we start to see some of this take hold as the Sadducees promoted and believed that there is no post-mortem existence. The Pharisees believed that you'd go to one of two places, either eternity in paradise or eternal punishment. But even as we get into the New Testament, we see references to eternal fiery punishment as being virtually absent. So Paul references, Paul references Hades. And he talks about death being swallowed up in victory, in 1 Corinthians. Jesus, when he references hell, talks about Gehenna. So he talks about that in probably about 12 different places in the Gospels. But Gehenna was really a pit of sacrifice to the god of Moloch. And anybody that was sacrificed there died, perished, ceased to exist. The references that Jesus uses to hell are ones that would explicitly bring to mind the connotation or the pictures or images of a temporary punishment, not as something that was lasting or eternal, or which those that were thrown in there suffered for a long period of time. In John's Apocalypse, he talks about the lake of fire. It says in Revelation 20:14-15 that death and Hades will be thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone's name whose name was not found in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire, but it does not. One, it's apocalyptic literature, which most take symbolically, some take historically, but it's very hard to derive doctrine from. But even in the book of Revelation, there is no reference to human beings suffering eternally and consciously. And I really think that's one of the misconceptions behind the doctrine of hell. So again, how did we advance in our pathway to eternal conscious torment? In the second century, we really see the apocalypse of Peter come to light, and that was really the first Christian text to describe eternal conscious torment. This is what inspired the 14th century vision of hell that Dante wrote about. In the 3rd century, we see Cyprian of Carthage, and we really see him talking about hell in his writings. As he says, the Lord will set on fire our persecutors with perpetual burning of penal fire. And as he writes about it with purpose. He writes about it as a hope, as we referenced previously, of justice coming, because at this point in time, there is a lot of persecution on the church. And so it was something that was formulated to give Christians hope that there would be, that they weren't suffering in vain, that there was some justice that was going to be, that was going to be formulated out of their suffering. And that was the purpose behind the teaching there. In the 4th or 5th centuries, in the Apocalypse of Paul, we see the eternal conscious torment being given or being ascribed to people that were people who persecuted Christians. But then also we see people in those visions of hell that are slack Christians, people that are heretics, and that agreed with church doctrine. And we really see it developing as a means of control. And then during that time is when Augustine wrote his City of God. And at that point, the eternal conscious torment view was really solidified. But what I really think happened, honestly, was the development of a need for retribution and vindication in the early church, and the desire to control believers by developing in the doctrine that was being developed within the church. Really combined with the, I think, Platonic influence of Hellenism, which assumed that the soul is inherently everlasting. And it really caused us to eisegete back into Scripture the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. It's not something that developed on its own, I suppose, through the reading of Scripture. We also, during those times, see different types of thought being formulated. Origen in the 2nd century talked about what he called apokatastasis, easy for me to say, which is really simply just the restoration of all things. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century was an Eastern theologian, a follower of Origen, talking about universalism as well. And so we see that developing very early on in the church. And one of the fun facts, one of the things that I saw during research that I did not know, was that there were 6 catechetical schools in the early church in the first couple centuries. And out of those 6 catechetical schools, only 1 taught the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, 1 taught conditionalism, and 4 of them taught universal restoration. So really early on, we see very wide and specific strains of other thinking developing besides eternal conscious torment. So I think we have enough to say here that it is historically fragile at best. But we also see that it's philosophically fragile, and there's a lot of ways to go about this. The one, R.T. Mullins, who wrote the philosophy chapter in Deconstructing Hell, the one he hones in on, the one philosophical argument is Jordan Wesley and his value account of love. And basically he says that, we know that God has certain qualities that a perfect God must have. A perfect God must exist. He must have aseity, which is, independence, self-sufficiency. He must be eternal, omniscient, good, rational, free, but he also must be a moral creature. So, God will always do what God has the most objective reason for doing. And that perpetuates, the moral values that he entails. And so if we look at the value account of love that Jordan Wesley developed, he says that love must value a person's existence, value flourishing, and value friendship. And one of the things that he very quickly points out when talking about ECT is that view of hell, eternal conscious torment, meets 0 out of those 3 values. In fact, every other one that we're going to present to you meets at least 1, 2, or sometimes 3 of those values. And we can talk about what Jordan Wesley prefers as an alternative. But philosophically, if God is a moral being, there are very sound arguments for saying that eternal conscious torment does not promote God is moral or God is loving. And lastly, as we mentioned, it's biblically unsound. So we talked about Sheol in Hebrew, Hades in the Greek, being a grave or being on another world, that being talked about in Scripture. In the New Testament, Gehenna being the valley of Hinnom, a place of sacrificial offering to Moloch. But really nowhere is eternal conscious torment for human beings seen. The concept of eternal conscious torment is really only found in one verse, and that's in Revelation 20:10. And it says, "And the devil was thrown into the lake of fire, the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet have been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever." So that's the one verse. And again, I will couch that by saying we're talking about oftentimes taken as symbolic in apocalyptic literature. And we're talking about non-human beings. We're talking about, folks that have been widely held as being, symbolic in even nation states, in their characterizations, such as the beast, being related to Babylon. So it's hard to draw the doctrine of eternal conscious torment from that one verse, but if you wanted to find it somewhere, there it is. But really, obviously not enough to describe or to substantiate a doctrine from. So lastly, before I open it up to questions, I want to show you a couple options, live options for reconstruction. So if we're going to say that, eternal conscious torment is historically suspect, philosophically fragile, biblically unsound, what are some options we can hold to that, might be good alternatives? And one of them is conditional immortality. That is the belief that those who reject God in this life will simply not exist in the next. So philosophically, some of the arguments are that the soul is not inherently immortal. So it requires sustaining activity, and the sustaining activity from God, that there is nothing saying that anybody is guaranteed immortal existence. And, from a process standpoint, we're talking more subjective immortality at this point, not necessarily objective immortality. And then libertarian free will as well, saying that must be preserved. So love entails choice, right? So if we choose God and say we want to be with him, we will. If we don't, in one form or another, we can choose not to. Conditional immortality kind of gives an out that is not eternal conscious torment. Not going to necessarily read the verses here. Maybe we can get into it in the discussion, because again, I want to give plenty of time here, but verses in Genesis and Philippians describing that the soul is mortal. Matthew, we already talked about the symbolism of Gehenna being spoken of. And really the weight of the evidence, a lot of people will say that if you're going to go, not necessarily from a philosophical standpoint, but from a pure biblical standpoint, and you had to really kind of dig in on one alternative, the weight of the evidence largely really has to land on conditional immortality. There's over 300 passages where God's judgment is death, cutting off, ceasing to exist, destruction, things like that. So that is one live option that does not entail eternal conscious torment. The second live option is universal restoration. So really, ultimately, the belief that all will be restored. Typically, this entails a purification process. So again, it doesn't say that hell doesn't exist, hell isn't real, but it's a place of refining by fire, a place of where the sin is purified from us, preparing us to be with God for eternity. So universal restoration has a lot of different, takes on it, but very rarely is there not, a purifying fire that's involved. So it's not escapism in a sense, or it doesn't not take sin seriously, or punish wrongdoing, but it does say ultimately that all will be restored. So philosophically speaking, it says that God is love, and love aims to restore. This is really the only view that affirms all three of Wesling's value accounts. It promotes life, it promotes well-being. And it says that Christ's work is responsive to Adam's rejection. So really, if Adam was a literal symbolic person, either way, Adam is seen as the rejection of God, and Christ is seen as being sufficient and efficient for the restoration of us towards God. When it looks at some of the speaking of hell in the New Testament, it talks about apocalyptic hyperbole. And so when, Christ is seen as talking about punishment, in Mark, he talks about, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your right arm causes you to sin, cut it off. This isn't a literal description of what we should do. It's saying deviation from my desires or sin, missing the mark, has consequences. But the speaking of death and destruction really is just a hyperbolic way of saying that same thing. It talks about how aionios, the Greek term that means eternal, is not necessarily selectively used, but used in different contexts in the Bible. So in Isaiah, when a similar term is used, it talks about destruction but restoration after a while, and it uses that specific term that's being seen as separation from God for eternity. Well, it's not eternity specifically. And so that word has various uses throughout Scripture. And so universal restoration says that, we can't necessarily say that when it talks about being separated from God, aionios, it really means for all times. And it sees fire as purifying. So, we already talked about that. Next, and second to last, we see relentless love. And this is my professor, Tom Oord's proposal. It's a proposal that says that God pursues us even in the afterlife. So it says that even those that aren't reconciled to God in this life are going to have options or opportunities later on. So philosophically speaking, it kind of takes the tension that universal restoration puts on free will, and I think it answers that. So it reconciles free will to say that, we're not all just justified, or we're not all just, restored to right relationship with God, but we are pursued until we decide positively for God. And ultimately it says that love is not coercive. So whereas with conditional immortality, there's not, chances given in the afterlife, and whereas with universal restoration, all is brought into relationship with God, this one says that God pursues us, but just not in a coercive way. He pursues us until we respond positively to him. So in the Bible, it talks about God's patient endurance. It talks about God always pursuing our well-being. And it talks about hope given primacy. So the hope of restoration. The last of the live options, I guess, for reconstruction, I'm borrowing here from our friend Jay McDaniel, who wrote a good article on this book once it came out, and kind of gave some of the options that he would consider based off of what was talked about in the book. But he proposes hell as a process of excruciating remorse born of honesty and empathy. He emphasizes the purifying and reconciling nature of hell, that it's felt by God, and God sympathizes with it, but it's not inflicted by God. He says that other alternatives that you can consider can be, hell is suffering in this life, might fit well into a process theistic mindset. Hell being in the mind, being, a symptom of depression and things like that, could all be kind of a hell here on earth. Hell is broken relationships. Hell is the violence and chaos of war. We can look at a lot of things that makes hell very real without saying that hell has to be a place of eternal conscious torment. So ultimately, in this 45 minutes that you've kindly given me, hopefully we've been able to see that hell negatively impacts us psychologically, culturally, relationally. It's historically suspect, biblically unsound, but hopefully also eternal conscious torment, once deconstructed, we are able to find some compelling alternatives for reconstructing a more relational, viable accounting of what hell means. So with that, I will conclude. I will stop sharing my screen here. Maybe.
Chad, that was really great. I'm going to let Jared field the questions. So if you have a question, please raise your virtual hand if you can, or if you can't, then unmute yourself and ask your question. And I might have a comment at the end if there's time.
Sounds
So,
good.
is my screen unshared?
Yeah, I got it for you.
Thank you so much.
I got all the wizardry at my fingertips here. So, all righty. Yeah. Anyone want to jump in? Feel free to raise your virtual hand, or there's few enough of us here that I could certainly see if you raise your physical hand as well. Otherwise, if you don't want to be on video tonight for whatever reason, feel free to put a question in the chat, and I'll read it out for you. So
let me jump in here and say that I see now that I'm done reading off slides and giving my talk, I see our good friend Jay McDaniel is here. So maybe you can help me elaborate on the last slide. I obviously ran through it pretty quickly and didn't do much justice to it, but from a process relational standpoint, how would you describe a good some plausible alternatives to eternal conscious torment? Not to put you on the spot. I'm sorry if I did.
Oh, well, Chad, I really just wanted to meet you because
thank you. Nice to meet you.
I've been following your work, and I follow you on Facebook, and I know of your interest in Schleiermacher now, and I'm just appreciative of your journey, and I really appreciate you lifting up that article that I wrote. But I'm here not to talk about me, but just to meet you.
You're very kind, Jay.
And you did a fine job of presenting my proposal. I think the first Christian process theologian to talk about hell in the way that I've talked about him was Schubert Ogden. Mm-hmm. And he wrote an essay in which he proposed that hell is empathy. Mm. And it was the idea that if we really felt the feelings of those whom we had harmed, that's an act of empathy. But we'd also, at the very same time, feel excruciating remorse. That's my phrase, I think, but deep remorse. And that makes sense to me. And I don't want to so soft pedal hell that it has no pain.
Right.
There does need to be pain. Yeah. But I do think it's a pain born of empathy and honesty, a true understanding of what has been done. So anyway, you did a great job of presenting that. I see that Jason Barker's got a comment. I want to hear what he has to say too.
Okay, I guess something that I've been encountering a lot of evangelicals who have kind of thought through and wrestled with the issue of hell. It seems like a lot of them, this is kind of getting, I guess, like old school with evangelicals, is a lot of those who've kind of rethought it seem to have turned to C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce.
Sure. And
kind of, I guess, in using your term, was it living options? Mm-hmm. That almost intense individualism would become then a kind of a form of hell, with the people who turn entirely in on themselves and must have everything their way and everything according to their own thoughts. And they essentially, hell is almost like a self-isolation, for, I guess, a lack of a better term. Would that be one of the possible options?
That's good.
Yeah, here, Neil Povey here. You just predated in a very prophetic way my commentary about C.S. Lewis's book, The Gates. Where he took this bus ride, metaphorically, of course, but very interestingly, to the gates of hell. And here was you have read the book, right? Yeah. When did you read it?
Oh, me?
Yeah. Recently?
For me, it was years ago, but I kind of kept bumping into it with other people, with other Christians rethinking hell and bringing that up as something that caused them to think about it in a new and different way.
Yeah, I think it's a profound and absolutely wonderful book. And all these people are met by companions who are of an angelic sort, and they are attempting to get the bus riders to walk deeper into the woods, which is metaphorically heaven. And a large majority of them want nothing to do with it. And and there is this one major character who has this little imp on his shoulder, and the imp keeps whispering in his ear, "Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it." And the companion, the angel, says, "Just walk with me, and this fellow will disappear after a little bit, walk into heaven away from hell." And I guess he does that. And many of the people want nothing to do with heaven. They want to be led and directed by their own greed and selfishness and so forth.
Yeah.
So, if I were to be asked about it, what would be my response would be something like that. But I don't know that Whitehead ever put the magnifying glass on hell.
No, I don't think he did. And Jay or Sherry or Jared, you can correct me. I haven't read a lot of his work yet. I've read some of it. I know that he, from a standpoint of objective immortality, he definitely, spoke about, and he was open to subjective immortality. But I don't know if he ever elaborated on much on what that looked like from the standpoint of final judgment, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that's accurate, Chad.
Yeah.
Completely accurate.
Okay.
He does actually use the word judgment in part 5 of Process and Reality.
Okay.
But he doesn't elaborate.
Yeah.
But he does speak of God's judgment of the world. Doesn't tell you a whole lot about it.
Mm-hmm.
But just for the record, there is a sentence in part 5 of Process and Reality where he uses the
Okay, thank you.
And Hartshorn denied completely subjective immortality. He just thought objective immortality. But I would suppose in the process community today, the majority view would be affirming of subjective immortality, but not necessarily holding a refined position around hell.
Right. I think David Griffin really helped bring a whole lot of process people around to the idea that there's a continuing journey after death.
Yeah.
We knew philosophically that was possible.
Right.
But Griffin kind of really made the case for it in a strong way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think increasingly process people do believe in a continuing journey after death, subjective immortality. It doesn't have to be immortal. And so that's a bit of a misnomer of a phrase. It could be for 125 years.
Yeah, he proposed a voluntary out, I suppose, right? I mean,
I don't know, but I think it's just an open question. And would immortality be desirable? That's a long time,
right?
But that there is a continuing journey is something many process people believe in.
Yeah.
And that includes John Cobb, by the way. But what they've not done is to think about purgation in that process.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to do in my article. And it was prompted really by your work. Somebody needs to take hell more seriously than we in the process community have.
Sure.
And I think your work prompts that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. There's a non-canonical bunch of writing is called the works of Enoch. You may remember him as the one who walked with God. He didn't die.
Right.
He just winked out. But there's a lot of scripture that is attributed to him, and some of the Eastern churches hold it as canonical, and you can get the whole load of them on Kindle for just a few bucks, and they're quite interesting. And some of the commentaries and mystiques about him was that he traversed hell and ministered to those who were trapped there, and evangelized them in that darker space that we could imagine.
Chad, if I could ask, if Jared, do you have a question? I wanted to ask Chad something, but only if you don't have a comment.
No rush. Go ahead.
Chad, I was wondering what you make of the theme of wrath, the wrath of God, and do you find a way to positively appreciate that idea? That's my question. And
yeah. No, okay, yeah. So I guess I don't have a great, well-developed answer to it. I think that love does entail disappointment, sadness. I think love entails anger. I think that those are all attributes that we would rightly ascribe to God. And, you know, even referring to the biblical writers, I think that's fairly pervasive. I'll say this: when we look at wrath and punishment and destruction in the Old Testament, I think a lot of the times, and this is me escaping from my my evangelical biblicism here, but I think a lot of the times we're reading the writer's views of God as painted by the culture of the time, and not necessarily attributes that exist within God himself. I think the warrior God, or the presentation of the warrior God, was something that the Old Testament culture dealt with. But I don't necessarily think that would be an accurate portrayal of God as he is. So I guess all of that to say, I look at the wrath seen in Scripture, and I take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, knowing that we have to have a kind of a cultural hermeneutic lens. One of the things that Tom has given me an opportunity to do is be part of this larger volume that's coming out next year on post-conservative evangelical hermeneutics. And so what I propose in my hermeneutic model is four things. I say that love is primary. So if it doesn't paint God as loving, it's not from God, it's not accurate. Jesus is the paragon. He's the ultimate representation of God, and the closest thing that we have to the most accurate portrayal, I guess, of God. That God is uncontrolling, and what that might entail would be even in the writing of Scripture. I don't think God could control or coerce accurate portrayals of him. And in that, inspiration is dynamic as well. And so, you know, it has a human element. So combining all those things, if I put wrath through my hermeneutic filter, I easily discount it, but I know that's not the answer you want. So,
you know, have you ever seen that icon of Jesus that is used in Orthodoxy, where he's looking at, and he has a rounded eyebrow and an arched eyebrow.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's a form of prayer in Orthodoxy. It's not that you look into Jesus's eyes, you let Jesus look into your heart. So imagine looking at that icon, one with the rounded eye and one with the arched eyebrow, and letting those eyes look into you. And the teaching is that the rounded eye is, I love you just as you are.
Yeah.
It's that welcoming. But the arched eyebrow is the laser-like love that burns away inordinate attachments. And both are love, not just the rounded eyebrow.
Yeah.
And that arched eyebrow as a laser love that burns away inordinate attachments, which are forms of idolatry,
Sure.
attachment to things finite as if they're infinite.
Absolutely.
That would be, for me at least, a way of thinking about wrath as laser-like love.
I like that. I think that's really cool.
I want to jump in here quick on wrath, and then let's let Jared ask his question, and then let's go to others, any others who haven't yet spoken, to ask a question. On wrath, Doug King, my friend that runs Presence International, he talks about God's wrath as being that system that's built into the cosmos that's kind of like karma, basically. That the wrath of God is just the consequences we experience of our actions. And I kind of like that.
Yeah.
So most of the sort of deconstructive material I've encountered around the doctrine of hell has been from a very different camp, from David Bentley Hart mostly, and his pretty big splash of a book, That All Shall Be Saved, from a number of years ago now. I'm wondering if you have any sort of comments on his approach, sort of anywhere that you might differ with his version of universalism. Anything you took from his treatment there?
No, thank you for the question. It's a great question. So I definitely have a lot of respect for David Bentley Hart. He has a large following. He's an extremely intelligent philosopher, theologian. From a personal standpoint, I find his style a little bombastic for me. He's definitely assured, but I think a lot of his arguments are compelling. I'll tell you the biggest thing I struggle with, and I'll tell you where I come down, even as someone who leans towards more of a process philosophy at this point in time in my journey. And I think that's where I'm finding myself. What I really want to fit into that, because I think it makes sense to me, is what I argue for in Deconstructing Hell, and that's the conditional immortality view. I struggle a lot with the free will issue. I struggle a lot with the fact that relationships have to be two-sided to be genuine. And I think that in order to choose positively towards God, we have to be able to choose against it. And that's why we mentioned like David Ray Griffin as a process philosopher, certainly not someone who affirms conditional immortality, but someone who proposes the fact that our subjective immortality can have a timeline to it. So philosophically, I struggle with universal restoration. I'm still one that wants to say, if it fits through my hermeneutic filter of the Bible, and there's a lot of breath taken to talk about death, destruction, separation, unless there's a good reason to reject it, we have to take it seriously. And right now, I definitely come down on the consequences of not embracing, not pursuing, and however that ends up being, and I'm not the judge of that, a relationship with God being consequential and having a significant and even permanent effect in the afterlife and affecting our subjective immortality. So I like David Bentley Hart, but I tend to be one that falls on probably in the progressive camp, what is the minority view, and I recognize that, but I would tend to affirm conditional immortality. And I would want to say that an uncontrolling God is not able to even control the consequences or the natural consequences of our sin, of our choices.
David is certainly not a friend to process thinking.
Oh yes,
so
he's not
that's-
either. Yeah, he is not a friend of process thought. So
No,
see, I'm trying to work within the realm of process thought. So
yeah. So yeah, that's
Both for
makes
me.
sense that there would be some divides there on
Yeah.
a pretty
Yeah.
deep level for sure.
Before I jump in with a final thought before we close, I do want to give an opportunity to anyone else who hasn't yet asked a question or made a comment. If you want to raise your hand, or if you can't do that because you're on a phone or something and want to just unmute and speak out, please do that.
I want to say thank you so much for coming to the talk. I appreciate your time.
Sure. Neil, if you want to jump in with something real quick, go ahead. Otherwise,
Okay.
I'm gonna just ask a quick question too.
I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a friend probably about 10 years ago. This guy was at the end of his rope, literally, and he had a dream. And in this dream, it was like an empty room that was just pervasive. And he was, and he asked me, he asked me what it was about, and I was tongue-tied. I had to just tell him to roll with it. And again, I meet with a lot of folks who are in hospice or otherwise smell the fires of hell or whatever. So thank you for bringing this about, and please giving me a chance to organize my thought. Bye-bye.
Cool, thanks. Chad, two things I'll just mention real quick. One is that I'd also heard regarding Gehenna that not only is it that idea of the sacrifice to Moloch, but that it was actually, at the time of Jesus, it was actually a physical place, a garbage pit outside of Jerusalem that constantly burned with fire. So he could have been using that as a symbol, of something, but really referring just to this literal thing that existed at that time. And the other comment I wanted to make, and it's interesting that I've not really read much Schubert Ogden yet. And so I find it interesting that the way that he talks about what the ideas that Jay brought up, because that aligns very closely with some of the people who've talked about near-death experience. Now, granted, we have to kind of take some of that with a grain of salt because it's not actual evidence, because they haven't actually fully died and then somehow come back and told us about it. But there's a very famous couple of books by a guy named Daniel Brinkley who had a major near-death experience that lasted, literally, he was gone like 20 minutes. He was gone. Oh. And what he talked about is, there was like the tunnel, the light, all that kind of stuff. But he said when he had this life review that he experienced, and he was a bad guy before this. He was like in the special forces and was one of the guys that went to Central America and assassinated people and stuff like that. So he was a bad guy. And he said in his life review, he experienced everything that he had ever done from three perspectives: as himself doing it, as the observer watching it, and as the person on the receiving end, and felt every single thing they felt. And so if that isn't hell, then I don't know what is. And that aligns really well with what Schubert Ogden suggests about that kind of empathy and feeling the feelings of the others. So he talked about that as exactly what he experienced. And I just think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, one of the chapters in, and I know we're trying to close here, but one of the chapters in Deconstructing Hell is written by Sharon Baker Putt. And she talks about hell as a process of purification in exactly what, kind of along the lines of what you were saying, that those who had done negative things in life, and the greater degree for the ones that have done the more wrong, but it's a process of them being subjected to seeing the consequences of those actions,
Right.
And of facing the people that they affected,
Right.
and of experiencing not only the love of God, but the love of the people and their forgiveness.
Yeah.
In the crushing, debilitating, just psychologically tormenting process of that. But at the end, once all that's experienced, the fresh revelation of love, who God is, and the forgiveness that is entailed in God. So those sins, that does have consequence, but it's ultimately, as we experience it in the afterlife, purified away.
Yeah, and as Brinkley talked about it, he did also say, and this is really key, that this whole time that he was experiencing this life review, all that he felt from the light, from the presence that he would have called God, is compassion. That's all that he felt from that, is compassion and love.
Yeah. How can we envision a God of love and expect anything close to judgment,
Right.
Anger,
Right.
retribution, I can't accept that.
Right. Yeah, me either. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I want to let you all go, but we appreciate so much your being with us. And we have recorded this, and Jared will, once the recording is, edited and put in a form where you can access it, he will send that link out to everyone. So we invite you to watch it, to, enjoy it again then.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Chad, the other thing I just wanted to mention is that, and I know I probably couldn't philosophically justify this real clearly as from a process perspective, or maybe even it's maybe inconsistent philosophically, but I just have this sense that, my sense is that we all go back to the source from which we came, and that there is no choice anymore. It's not that we have no choice.
Yeah.
It's just that it's a whole different experience. Like what we have here in this world as we live and have choice, and where the opposites rule, where binaries exist, and where the opposites cause embodiment to actually be, then choice is essential. But
I don't think it's inconsistent. I think that's very consistent with the majority of Christian scholarship that evokes what they call soft determinism.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not that your decisions are controlled. It's the fact that you come along a hallway, it's a dead end. You look to your left and see paradise. You look to your right and see a raging fire coming your way. Which way will you always turn? Right. So free will isn't taken away, but you're always directed towards where you want to be, and you will always get to where you want to be. So I don't think that's inconsistent at all. And if that's the case, then I would say the majority of scholarship's inconsistent. So I'm with you on that.
But I definitely don't think there is that. I don't think there is any hell in that sense.
Sure.
In the sense of like you talked about that
Correct.
traditional doctrine.
Correct.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So, all right. Well, now I will really let everyone go, and I'm going to go myself. So
thanks, guys. Thanks
so much, Chad. Really appreciate it. It was great.
Bye, Sean.
Yep. Thanks, Chad. Good to meet you.
You too.
Take care.